So you might have walked 10 kilometers on a random planet, find a random outpost, and leave some sandwiches there. The game now remembers that exact spot, as well as what you've done in those 10 kilometers of tiles you just loaded in, like picking flowers. Hey guys, Dantix here, back with another Starfield video, one I really didn't want to have to make, but damn it, do some people need to hear it. So I'll keep this extremely quick and get back to the breakdowns I love doing. Look at this, proof that there are multiple biomes on the same planet and a dynamic weather system in place. Take that and apply it to over 1,000 planets and moons. Now, Bethesda have come out to say that Starfield is locked at 30 frames per second for Xbox Series X and S, but 4K for X. In my opinion, this is not a bad thing given the type of game Starfield is trying to be. But I'm not the most technical person, so instead, I refer to the judgment of Digital Foundry, but I mix in some real examples like the one above. Digital Foundry are unsurprised to find out that Starfield is locked at 30 frames per second, but instead they expect that with a game of this scope. Digital Foundry mentions that they're often asked, why are you okay with this game being 30 FPS but not others? They go on to explain the reasons why, and once you hear the answer, I feel you'll understand just why the guys who focus their whole channel around video game performance think that the game is nothing short of impressive. Before I start, if you want to win yourself a 3080 in order to get those frames up, or a copy of Starfield, stay tuned to this video to find out how. So Digital Foundry, who you should check out on YouTube, emphasize that frame rate is a design decision. Hardware going back to the 80s have no problem executing games at 30 FPS. This has always been the case. It always comes down to what a developer is trying to do, the maximum frame rate they can achieve with their vision, aka how many moving parts they want the game to have. Digital Foundry go on to explain that Starfield is massive in its scope, and on top of that, it's an open universe game that's designed for object permanence and managing so many different interlocking systems to create a wholly immersive experience. We've seen object permanence in their prior games where you can leave an object with its own physics somewhere in the map, like a shelf or on the floor, and the game will remember its position and you can return and it'll still be there. Obviously, this is much larger in scale, as it not only has a world, it has worlds the size of worlds, over 1,000 planets and an unknown amount of ships, space stations and more. So you might have walked 10 kilometers on a random planet, find a random outpost and leave some sandwiches there. The game now remembers that exact spot, as well as what you've done in those 10 kilometers of tiles you just loaded in, like picking flowers. Else you could just load out and back in and those flowers would have regenerated instantly. One example is they use the sandwich pirate moment in the Direct, where a Bethesda dev would delight in stealing people's sandwiches and hoarding them on her ship. Even though it was used as a funny moment, Digital Foundry finds this a great example of object permanence because it shows that the game is designed to store the position of any item you pick up and drop. We see them stacked on a table and each sandwich is positioned in a particular way in a particular spot in the game, and that needs to be stored. Yes, this did go back to Morrowind with the creation engine, but Starfield is much larger. It goes beyond item permanence. Digital Foundry mentioning that the underlying systems are complex. AI is brought up next. In the Direct, you see the player entering massive cities that have numerous NPCs walking around with their own AI. Ryan McAfee from IGN, one of the only people in the world outside of Bethesda to play the game for a short while, stated that the city was the largest they've ever done and it was filled with NPCs, all of which you could interact with. We also know that you can then transition from the city to the wilderness without any loading screens, and the wilderness has its own wildlife with their own AI. All of this to a scope that Bethesda games haven't done before. They then go on to mention the quote from Todd Howard, which they agree with. Todd Howard says, it's 4K on the Xbox Series X and it's 1440 on the Xbox Series S. We do lock it at 30 because we want that fidelity. We want all that stuff. We don't want to sacrifice any of it. Now, he uses the word fidelity and people think just graphics, but it's a lot more than that. The crux of Digital Foundry's argument is that, at least on consoles without a variable refresh rate, going from 30 to 60 and in between frame rates like 40 and 50, you're not getting a good looking experience. You might get an input latency experience that's good enough, but you're not getting a visually pleasing one. They go on to say that it's preferable to have a stable 30 rather than an unstable 60, cutting the issues with performance versus quality mode in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, where they recommend you just play on quality mode as the frames jumping around in performance mode didn't look as visually pleasing. Overall, they believe the game will be very taxing on the CPU rather than your GPU. Because of this, the developers might want to lock it down to 30 frames per second for consistency's sake, and yet again, a constant 30 frames per second looks better than a variable that jumps around. The perfect underline to this point is the example they show with Star Citizen. This is a fabulous example and I commend Digital Foundry for it. With a 2070 Super and a Ryzen 5 3600 on a desolate empty moon, you can see the GPU utilization is at 99%. That means the GPU is a limiting factor here. But notice it's running at around 60 frames per second. When we're shown a larger city, you see the frame rate plummet to around 17 FPS, but if you look, it's not the GPU, it's the CPU that's struggling. So this is probably what's going on with Starfield. Some areas are extremely CPU intensive, and especially on consoles, they thought it wise to lock it down to 30 frames per second for consistency. Now, these are completely different games, and obviously there's a lot more going on in Starfield, even in empty areas. But the point was to display that more populated areas hit the CPU much harder, and that's where the bottleneck will be. Digital Foundry go on to say that Starfield, in their opinion, is Bethesda's first truly beautiful game they've ever made. Not to say their other games were ugly, but this time they've done something to their rendering that makes it stand out. There's just so much variety. They also mentioned that the camera is satisfying, and it was very static and rigid in Skyrim. They also noticed the micro details on the ground, and these aren't repeating textures like in Oblivion. They highlight that this scene is a particularly great example of how the materials just work. Everything looks good. Reflections on weapons, excellent lighting, and camera blur. It looks great. What they disliked the most though was the character rendering. Whatever procedural system they use to render dialogue to the faces, it doesn't work out the best. How the characters move when they talk feels the most uncanny. I agree, but it still looks leagues better than anything they've done before, and with a mountain of dialogue that's in the game, it would have been hard to mocap every actor's performance. So they still feel like this is an amazing game and are surprised it exists at all. Now, I have to agree with them on most points. Like I said, I'm not the most technically savvy person, and I'm mostly happy to jump on board for the ride and ignore the technical, which is why I refer judgment to groups like Digital Foundry. However, they summarize my thoughts perfectly. Locking the game at 30 FPS is not the end of the game for console owners. In fact, I think it's a good thing. They want to control how the game looks, runs, and feels. It's a huge game with a ton of moving parts, and to say it would be easy to get a game like this at 4K, at 60 frames, that's just a ridiculous notion. The trailer was running the game mostly around 30 frames per second, and it looked great. This is an RPG after all, not a shooter. Doom Eternal looks fantastic, but it has a stage to render, and that's it. The scope of Starfield is frankly mind-blowing, and I wouldn't be surprised if it actually doesn't exist at all and it's one big joke. So that's everything I want to take you through. What did you think? Still bummed about the lock? Let me know below, but try to keep it civil. I recommend checking out Digital Foundry for more tech breakdowns, and hey, I have a way for you to get up your frames. I recently upgraded to a 4090, so why not give away my 3080 and a few copies of Starfield? If you want to be in the running, all you need to do is be subscribed, hit the bell, and like and comment on my Starfield videos. For more entries, do the same on other Starfield videos or check out my Twitter and Discord. The winner will be chosen using RNG, so more entries give you more chances. Best of luck and thank you so much for watching. I'll be covering the game more than anyone else, so be sure to stay tuned. Ciao friends.